So this video is the first video in the new series Europe Divided, and it's looking at life shortly after the Second World War. As we know, the United States were very fearful of the spread of communism, and they adopted policies of what they called containment to try and contain communism, and they were scared of what they saw as the domino effect. But rightly so, because after World War II, communism was spreading. As we know, Stalin took over the Eastern Bloc, and he kept control and installed communist governments in that buffer zone that he created in Europe. But a really significant one was actually China. China became communist in 1949 under Mao. He established the People's Republic of China, and this was a huge scare for the United States because previously they had been giving aid under the Marshall Plan, which we'll talk about in a minute, to the nationalists who were defeated. And so that was a real blow for the United States when China became communist. It was already the most populous country in the world and was a huge figure in Asia, and so that was a real concern. And then also North Korea and Vietnam were problematic as well. So after World War II, when Japan was defeated in the Pacific, it left a huge power vacuum, and so those two countries endured lots of years of anti-colonial events to try and kick their former colonial masters out of the country. And then soon the United States and the Soviet Union were interfering to try and establish their own governments in North Korea and Vietnam, which led to those two proxy wars between the two superpowers. And so all of a sudden there was a hysteria in the United States about the Red Scare. Now this wasn't the first Red Scare. They were also concerned during the Russian Civil War when American troops and international troops went to intervene as part of the White Army. But this was especially bad after the Second World War. And as you can see, propaganda started to become more and more common, anti-communist propaganda. As we can see here, we've got Stalin's face on an octopus with its tentacles infecting every continent around the Earth. And this is what they saw to be the issue, the domino effect. They were afraid that if certain regions fell, then communism would spread really, really quickly. And so the Iron Curtain is an important phrase that comes out of the Cold War, and the Iron Curtain is used to describe that buffer zone, that metaphorical iron wall that was splitting Europe in half. In 1946, Winston Churchill made a famous speech where he referenced the Iron Curtain, and I'd like you to read that carefully because we'll be talking a bit more about this source in class, as well as the following cartoon to do with the Iron Curtain. And so in response to this, President Truman had to make a strong statement about America's position in politics. And so a few crises broke out in the late 1940s. So in 1947, Greece was facing a civil war between the government and communists, and so this was a big wake-up call for America, and they realised that they had to intervene. Otherwise, in Greece as well as Turkey and Iran, they looked very likely to fall to the Soviets. Now, these weren't just any countries; these are strategic countries. So Greece and Turkey have very strategic positions in the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. And Iran has very rich oil deposits, and so the US had an interest in trying to again be proactive and get involved and combat these communist ideas that were coming into these countries. And so Truman made a speech announcing that he would be giving aid to Greece and Turkey to help them fight the communists. But then he broadened this to what became known as the Truman Doctrine, where he committed to helping any country anywhere that was trying to resist communism. And so an extension of this is what became known as the Marshall Plan. So they came up with an economic plan to actually aid countries that were trying to resist communism around the world. And after World War II, many countries were broken and economically extremely weak, which the United States saw as making them really vulnerable to communism. So the United States government spent $13 billion propping up these countries and trying to get them back on their feet to make them less likely to be infected with communism. And so this highlights America's policy of containment, trying to contain the spread of communism, and giving out billions of dollars in the process was one practical step in that direction. And so these are some of the initial issues that were facing the two superpowers after World War II. And in theory, they had an idea as to what they wanted the post-World War II world to look like, but in practice, they needed to make some bold statements and some solid moves that obviously involved a lot of money and a lot of planning, and that's what happened. So in the next video, we'll look at the first major crisis of the Cold War, and we'll see how close these two superpowers came to a military confrontation.